Hi everyone. Thank you all for joining my session. First of all, welcome to TDX19. I hope all of you guys have some fun and also do some great learning along the way in the next few days. So firstly, my name is Calvin Norona. I am a senior program architect with Salesforce, and I'm based out of Melbourne in Australia. So this session is about OAuth with Salesforce. This session was previously presented at Dreamforce a couple of times, and this session is an updated version of the previous one. And it's all about giving a basic introduction to the concepts of OAuth with Salesforce. So moving on, quickly get this out of the way. If you're making any purchasing decisions with Salesforce, make them only on features which are currently available. So a quick review of the agenda for today. OAuth obviously is a very large topic or large subject, so we are limiting ourselves to the basics of OAuth with Salesforce. And before we jump into what OAuth is, we need to understand what is the difference between two concepts, authentication and authorization. So first, we look at authorization, and OAuth 2.0 falls under the broader domain of authorization. So we'll look at some of the key concepts that we need to learn when we are looking at OAuth with Salesforce. And once we do that, we'll jump into our first demo, which is related to OAuth. And after that, we look into the second, in the second half, we look into authentication. And we look at a concept called OpenID Connect. And after we look at OpenID Connect, we'll jump into our second demo. And then we'll do a quick review of the identity and access management designer certification. Now, I think some of you or most of you may be actually attending the boot camps for this certification, and the concepts today are going to be related to other learnings as part of that exam. And finally, we're going to summarize with our key takeaways from the session, and then we'll end with Q&A. So if I can please request all of you to please keep your questions till the end of the session, and if you can come to the mic at the end of the session and ask your questions. And in case we run out of time, I'm happy to step out in the corridor and help answer any questions if there are. So with that, let's move on to the first topic. So authentication and authorization. Now, the first thing to understand is that these are two distinct concepts. So the best analogy I have is the process of checking into a hotel. Now, those of you who do Airbnb must be thinking, what is this guy talking about? But please work with me here. So if you check into a hotel, the very first thing you do at the front desk is that you provide two pieces of information. One is your ID information, and the second is maybe a payment, like a credit card. So the ID could be a driver's license, or it could be a passport. And the reason it identifies you is because someone with authority has given you that identification, like a state government or a federal government. So that basically says the person checking in is actually who he or she claims to be. So once you check into the hotel, the next thing that happens is you get a key pass. And this is authorization, because you have permissions with your key pass. Now, your key pass, your room access key, can give you access to maybe your room, maybe a few other areas of the hotel, like a fitness center, for example. Now, compare that with the key pass that someone at the hotel has, like a manager or someone working there, right? So they obviously, their key card gives them access to different areas of the hotel. So that's the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication is again about identity, and authorization is all about permissions. So quickly, the definitions of these. Authentication basically verifies a user based on a set of verifiable credentials. So when you have a server and a client, the server is trying to identify the identity of the client, and it does that either by itself or it does that by forwarding that request to another provider. So authentication broadly falls under the domain of identity management. Authorization, on the other hand, happens after authentication. And basically here the system is trying to verify the access of an authenticated user, and the system can then either go ahead and grant permissions or withdraw permissions from the user. So authorization is access management. So that's about the basic concepts of authentication and authorization. So moving on, let's start with authorization, because OAuth comes under this. So the very first thing is OAuth or open authorization. Now, many of us, including myself, before I learned what OAuth was, we invariably end up using OAuth, but we are probably not aware that we're using OAuth. So two examples here on the left side, you have Salesforce. You may have seen this screen when you use Salesforce, right? So there's some application asking you for permissions, and you get two options. You can either deny or allow this access. On the right-hand side, this example is if you have a blog or another website, and you want to log in there and post a comment using your Twitter credentials, you end up seeing a screen like this. So what's happening behind the scenes, underneath the hood, is basically OAuth. So the official definition of OAuth, and the version currently is 2.0. The official definition is, it's an open protocol that has been agreed upon by all parties, which allows secure authorization in a simple and standard method for any web, mobile, or desktop applications. And that link there is the official definition of OAuth that has been agreed upon by everyone. So what does this mean in simple terms, right? So what this means is that if I have data in application B, application A can actually access my data in application B without necessarily having my password. So in other words, what this means is that for an admin or for someone with security, this results in peace of mind because your password is not being given out to that other application which needs access to your data. So what are the benefits of OAuth then, right? So the benefits of OAuth, first of all, is the answer to the question, how can an app access my data without giving the app my password? So OAuth is the answer. So the question is, can you trust a third-party application with your password? So in the days before OAuth, like the late 90s, early 2000s, or the noughties, if you had to go and access another website and give access to your Twitter or Facebook, you had to actually enter your password in that application. So if that application was malicious or if that application was compromised, then you lose data invariably. So OAuth comes and helps you there because your password is not being shared. So with OAuth, access can be given and can be revoked just as easily. And also for all of us developers here, we don't have to put our passwords in our config files or in our code because OAuth takes that away from you. And finally, as an end user, you have a choice. In the OAuth flows that give you a choice, you can actually allow and deny with the click of a button. So these are some of the key benefits of OAuth. So the next concept is the concept of an OAuth flow. So here, the OAuth flow generally means that it's a sequence of steps that are taken between the client and server to establish the OAuth protocol. And there are a lot of different flows that we'll see a little later in the slides, but the generic flow is being shown here. There are 4 key actors here. Is the user, represented by our favorite Astro. And then you have a client application, which could be either a desktop or a mobile-based application. And then you have the concept of an authorization server, and it's represented by lock, right? So this server is doing all the authorization on behalf of a user. And then you have the resource server, which actually contains the data that the application is trying to access. More often than not, the resource server and authorization server are the same systems. For example, Salesforce has different endpoints for authorization and a different endpoint for the API access using either REST or SOAP APIs. So here what happens is that the user is using the app. At some point, the app wants to access data on behalf of the user, so that request is sent to the user in the screen that you saw previously, right? So if the user goes ahead and grants access to the application, the authorization server checks that request, and if the request looks good, the authorization server will then go ahead and issue the access token to the client application. And we'll see what this access token is in the next slide. So basically, using the access token, the client application can then access data on the user's behalf. And after that, any other subsequent requests to the resource server, they are handed off to the authorization server. So this is the general typical OAuth flow, and these are the typical actors in an OAuth flow. So then, if usernames and passwords are not being used in the OAuth flow, then what's being used, right? So the answer is the token. So tokens are the basic building blocks of OAuth, and they do all the heavy lifting for you. They are the proof of authorization. So there are 3 types of tokens. The first one and the most important one that we need to learn about is the access token. So this is a short-lived token. This is used by your application to get access to your APIs. And in Salesforce, this is synonymous to your session ID. There's also the concept of a refresh token. We're not going to look at it in detail, but basically, the refresh token is a long-lived token for an application which does not want to do the OAuth flow every time. So when the access token is invalid, it can do the refresh token flow and get a new access token. And the third type of token is the ID token. As the name suggests, you must be thinking this is related to authentication. And so we'll see this in the second half as to what this token does. So these are the different tokens that we have, and we'll focus on the access token for now. So the next concept is the concept of the connected app in Salesforce. So this is basically a special kind of Salesforce app that allows any application to access the Lightning Platform APIs or the Salesforce APIs using OAuth 2. And using this, the application can either do authentication, do single sign-on, And single sign-on basically means you can use one set of credentials to access different systems. And also the application can get tokens using the connected app. Now the other thing to note is that the concept of a connected app is not unique to Salesforce. A lot of different applications which use OAuth have this, like LinkedIn, Twitter, and any other application. And when you configure a connected app, the two pieces of information that are very important is, first of all, the callback URL. This means where should the application send the response to? And also the concept of scope, which means what does my application get access to in terms of data and other things that it can look at in Salesforce. So once you configure the connected app, you'll receive two pieces of information. The first thing is the client ID and the client secret. And we'll talk about this in the next slide. But once you get these two pieces of information, this is important to continue working on OAuth for your application. And the other key important thing about the connected app is that administrators, they can control which users get access to the connected apps using our familiar Salesforce constructs such as profiles, permission sets, and you can also do IP restrictions to limit access. So these are the key important points about a connected app in Salesforce. And a quick look at it. This is from my demo today. So I've highlighted 4 key things: the client ID, the client secret, 2 of the scopes, which is my basic information, and my API access, and finally the callback URL. Where should the response be sent, and where should the browser be redirected to? So this is about the connected app. Quickly about the terminologies that we learned in the previous slide. So client ID. Think of this as a public identifier for your application. So different systems have different kinds of IDs. For example, GitHub has a smaller string. You saw the example of Salesforce, and we look at the example of Twitter in the subsequent slides. Then you have the concept of a client secret. Now this one is basically a secret value that is known only to the app and the application server. For that reason, we should not include this in a mobile-based application or a browser-based application, because this could be compromised. And the last option, or the last concept, is the concept of a scope that, as I mentioned, controls the types of resources that the application has access to. So different values in Salesforce include API or full access, and that's a list of all the other OAuth scopes that are part of the connected app in Salesforce. So that's about these terms with OAuth. Next are the list of different flows that Salesforce supports. There's so many different flows. I'm not going to go into each one of them in detail, and because of time factors, we're going to look at 2 of these flows in a little more detail now. And then we're going to look at the user agent flow as part of our demo, because it is one of the simple OAuth flows to understand. So with that, let's go to the web server flow. So the web server flow basically is used by web server applications. And these applications need to interact with the Salesforce APIs on your behalf. Now, these web apps run on servers such as Heroku, AWS, Azure, and they basically, in these servers, the code is not available publicly, which means that there's a little bit of a higher degree of security, because you're using your client secret, and the client secret is protected in these applications. So once again, to summarize, the use case for the web server flow is when you have a web application which is running on a secure web server, and it can securely store your consumer secret or your client secret. So to see how this flow works, there are 2 main actors here, the client application and Salesforce. So once the client application needs to access Salesforce on your behalf, it will redirect the user to the Salesforce authorization endpoint. So at that point, if the user is not authenticated, the user will authenticate himself or herself, and then you get the same page which we see, right? The page which shows you the options of either granting or denying access. So if the user goes ahead and approves the page, Salesforce does something. It sends the authorization code back to the client application. So then the client application takes that authorization code, and it constructs a second request. And this request is called the access token request, and it is to the token endpoint in Salesforce. And when Salesforce receives it, if it likes that request, it's then going to go ahead and grant the access token. And then using that access token, the client application can make API calls using any of the APIs in Salesforce to extract whatever data it needs to and perform any operations in Salesforce. So that is the high-level flow of the web server OAuth flow with Salesforce. So the token request that we saw previously, the second request, so this basically is in the form of a URL, and the key thing to note is the OAuth 2/token, right? That's the endpoint in Salesforce. And then the client application is going to send the right parameters, which include the grant type, client ID, client secret, and the redirect URI, which means where should the response be sent to. So if Salesforce receives it, and if it likes the request, everything tallies up, it's going to respond with this payload. And this is the typical OAuth response. So the first and foremost thing to note here is that this response is JSON, right? So the response in OAuth is in the form of JSON. And the most important thing, obviously, is the first piece of information, which is the access token, a long string in Salesforce. And as I mentioned, this string is analogous to the session ID in Salesforce. So the application can use the access token and access the APIs in Salesforce. So this is the request and response for OAuth. Next, let's quickly look at another flow, which is called the JOT or the JWT bearer token flow. So for this flow, basically we set up a connected app as usual, but here we create a certificate locally and we upload that certificate into the connected app. And then any client application which needs to use this JOT bearer token flow, it will generate the JOT or the JSON web token. And then it's going to sign that JSON web token with the certificate's private key. And then this payload is going to be posted to the token endpoint, as we can see in this figure here. And so the token endpoint in Salesforce, it's going to validate the signature because it has the certificate. It knows that the client application has used this certificate to sign the payload. So therefore, the access token is then issued to the application. And again, once the application has the access token, it can use the APIs to retrieve or write data into Salesforce. So to summarize, the use case here is when you have a server-to-server API integration. The example could be Azure or AWS extracting or writing data into Salesforce. And the fundamental thing to understand here is that you don't need a user to be present here. In the previous flow, you had a user, and there's a page where the user says accept or deny the request, right? So here there's no user. So it's happening without the user's manual intervention. So this is the JOT bearer token flow. So I quickly just want to tell you that based on my experience, from an academic perspective and a professional perspective, right? In my day-to-day work with my customers and other engagements, I see that the JOT bearer token flow is being used more often by developers and architects. And the reason, just some of the key things to understand about this flow. And once again, this flow is considered to be a bit of the specialized OAuth flows. So obviously, start with the simpler ones and then make your way over to this one. And some of the key things to understand with this flow is that JSON is less verbose than XML. So JSON the payload ends up being smaller, and therefore it's easy to sign it with a certificate. And JSON is supported by most of the programming languages out there, like Node.js, JavaScript, Java, C#, Ruby on Rails. And JWT and JSON are fundamentally designed for use at large scale, or the scale of internet. Think millions of transactions and things like that. So this is a typical payload or the JOT. It comprises of succinct information, pieces of information here, like the AUD or the audience parameter, the subject parameter. And when you encode this, when I say encode, you basically base 64 encode the string. This is how the string looks like. And this is an example of the base JOT and how it looks when it's being encoded. So that's some quick notes about the JOT bearer token flow. Some of the other key OAuth flows that we have. First one is the user agent OAuth flow. So this flow is being used when you have a client-side mobile or browser application, and this application cannot secure the client secret. Therefore, use this flow. It's one of the easiest flows in my opinion, and it's one of the flows that you can start learning OAuth with. And because we didn't have time to look at all these flows today, in our demo, we'll quickly look at the user agent flow. So next one is the username password flow. As the name suggests, the password is part of the OAuth request. Therefore, it is frowned upon. You don't use this in any professional code. It's mainly used for testing purposes. Then those of you who know SAML, SAML is a concept used with single sign-on. You can use a SAML assertion with a digital signature also to obtain an OAuth access token. And the last one is a more recent flow. It's called the device authentication flow. So any command line application or any application which does not have a browser, such as a smart TV, a smart appliance, or any IoT, Internet of Things devices. So a good example would be if you use Netflix on your PlayStation 4 or Xbox. When you first log in, it will give you a link and a code to go to a browser. And when you enter that, automatically you get logged into Netflix. So what's happening there behind the scenes is the device authentication flow. And Salesforce supports this flow as well. So these are the other key flows that we need to be aware of. So with that, we'll move on to our first demo. So here what I'm doing is I'm using the user agent OAuth flow. And basically I have a simple web page which is hosted on Heroku. And what I'm doing here is I'm using this flow, and I am getting the access token from Salesforce. And once I get the access token, I'm then issuing a simple SOQL query to just get a list of account records and display that on the screen, just to demonstrate that we can get an access token using OAuth and then fetch information from Salesforce. And quickly about this, I'm using a library called ForceTK. So there are so many different libraries available like ForceTK, which is slightly outdated, but it's more easy to learn. And there's also another library called Force.js. So what these libraries allow you to do is they allow you to have a web application and then use that web application to use OAuth to connect into Salesforce. So with that, let me move on and show you the demo. I hope this works with all the stuff. So anyway, this is a simple page, and I have a button here that should kickstart the OAuth process. Because I'm already logged into Salesforce, it's not asking me to log into Salesforce because I'm already authenticated in Salesforce. So this is our familiar screen that we see, right? My connected app is asking me for my basic information and manage my data. That's the API access. So I'm going to go ahead and say allow. A lot of stuff happened behind the scenes. All the OAuth dons happened behind the scenes. And so I'm just printing out the information quickly just to show you what happened. So because this was the user agent flow, right, I'm only using one request, and that is the authorized endpoint. And what I did was I just passed the client ID to Salesforce. Salesforce apparently liked the request, and it sent my application back that JSON payload. And I'm just printing out the JSON information here. This is the most important thing, the access token. And then the token type is the bearer. You'll hear the word bearer many times in OAuth, and what the word bearer basically means in OAuth means that anyone who bears or anyone who has possession of this OAuth token can basically get data from the application or the server that has given that person the token. So the other key things is which instance URL this was, and the signature, and also the timestamp, which is currently the time in Australia at this moment, which is 9 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so that's that, and then these are the accounts fetched from Salesforce as part of the SOQL query. So this is a simple demo. Quickly, just to show you what was set up in Salesforce, I'll just refresh this page. So in Salesforce, on the configuration side, all I did was I configured the connected app. And as you saw, I got two key pieces of information, the client ID and the client secret. And I've given the application just two scopes. So the thing to note about scope is give the application only the bare minimum scope that's necessary for it to do its job. And that's very critical when you're starting to design OAuth applications. And then the next one is the callback URL. Where should the response be sent? And in this case, it's my HTML page hosted on my Heroku server. So, and another quick note about the connected app is that you have the manage page, and there you can actually go and view your OAuth usage. Okay, that took a while. And you can also click here. And you can see that my user, obviously I've been testing this quite a bit, has used this connected app 29 times right now. And you can actually go ahead and revoke access as well. So this is where the revocation happens in case there's a problem with this application. So that's about the connected app in Salesforce. So quickly just looking into the code, just a quick high-level view. So this is my fundamental web page, which was shown here. So I'm importing all the JavaScript libraries that are necessary, including the ForceTK library. And here I'm using some variables to set the login URL, the client ID from the connected app, and so on and so forth. And when my button was clicked, I'm creating that pop-up window, and I'm constructing my authorized endpoint by passing all the parameters from this application. So that goes to Salesforce. Salesforce responds back, and that is this OAuth callback page. Just an example of how the callback page works. So here what I'm doing is I'm just taking the URL that was sent back to me by Salesforce, I'm parsing it, and I'm constructing an array that contains some information, including the access token. And then I'm calling the session callback function back in this page. Now this is a callback function. This function basically checks, is the access token part of the array? If so, it goes ahead and it uses the ForceTK library, and there's a method called setSessionToken. It's as simple as just setting the access token in your library, and your library has abstracted everything. It provides you a function to basically run a query, and this is a simple query on accounts, just give me names and last modified dates, and then the query is executed, and then I'm parsing through the response and displaying it on the web page. So that, in a nutshell, is all about the code here. So that concludes the demo. So let's go back to our session and the presentation. So moving on, the second part of this is authentication. So first of all, OpenID Connect. So we saw that OAuth 2.0 is great for providing authorization, and some of us know that SAML exists for single sign-on and authentication. Think of OpenID Connect as an alternative to SAML for identity management or authentication or single sign-on. So OpenID Connect is nothing but an identity layer that has been built on top of OAuth, because OAuth cannot be used for authentication, so there's an identity layer built on top of it. And basically, an authorization server is now doing the authentication of a user as well. So Salesforce supports this extensively. You can use Salesforce also as an OpenID Connect, and you could have another Salesforce using your first Salesforce instance to log into the second Salesforce instance. You could do that. So this is one of the most, it's happened in the last few years, and a lot of different systems and applications are using OpenID, and they have become providers of OpenID, including Facebook, Microsoft, AWS, and obviously Salesforce. So then the question is, why can't we use OAuth 2.0 for authentication? So one key takeaway is obviously OAuth is representative of your permissions. It was designed only for permissions. It wasn't designed with identity in mind. And the access token, once again, represents your permissions. It does not represent your identity. So OpenID Connect helps us to implement single sign-on. And so the way I remember this is OpenID Connect is nothing but OAuth plus authentication. So that's the idea of OAuth and OpenID Connect. So quick look at the protocol itself. Again, there are three actors here. So again, the user is requesting a service from a client application, who will then redirect the user to go to the authorization server. If the user has not authenticated themselves, they'll go ahead, authenticate themselves, and then they'll go ahead and authorize the client. So once that happens, you get the auth code as before, and then the subsequent request, the client application is going to do the request for the access token. So until step 5, it's kind of similar to what we've seen previously. But in step 6, now you see that the response contains the access token as well as the ID token. So this ID token is the new concept introduced in OpenID Connect. So using that ID token, now the client application not only has the permissions of the user, it also knows who that user is, and it can use this information to actually get further information about the user. And the user profile is then given to the client application. So this is how the OpenID Connect differs from OAuth, because in OAuth you get only the access token, which is permissions, and in OpenID Connect you get the ID token also, which is representative of the user's identity. So this is a typical response from OpenID Connect. The top part is fundamentally the same, but there's a large section there, which is the ID token here. So you guessed it, if you are right, this is basically encoded, and if the client application then decodes it using the signature, this is the actual payload. And you have seen this previously. This is a JOT or a JWT that is being sent back to you by your authorization server. So this is how the response of OpenID Connect looks like. So then let's move on to our second demo. This will be a very short demo. In this, what I'm doing is I'm trying to log into Salesforce using my Twitter credentials. And Twitter here is the OpenID Connect provider. And we'll see how quickly we can set this up. It's pretty easy to set this up. And we'll also see something called an authentication provider in Salesforce. So let's go and quickly look at that demo now. So for this, let me log out of Salesforce as the Salesforce user. And here in the login options, I actually have this. And this is basically my Twitter credential. I'm just going to click on it. Because I'm logged into Twitter already, we quickly saw just a brief flash of the Twitter page saying I'm redirecting you back. So now this user who's logged into Salesforce is basically a Twitter user. So I didn't use Salesforce credentials. I used the third-party credentials and logged into my system. And this can happen on the fly. And I'll show you how. So let me log out of this and log back in as the system administrator, just to show you the setup. So in Salesforce, we have the concept of the auth provider or the authentication provider. You can set it up for very different providers. This one is set up for Twitter. So two things here, the client ID and the client secret. Where did I get these pieces of information from? So as I mentioned to you previously, every application has their own version of the connected app. So you could go to developer.twitter, for example, to create an app, Twitter's version of the connected app. You could do that for Facebook, Microsoft, any other application. So this is the example for Twitter, and this is my application here. So I go ahead, I create this application. There are two things you need to exchange. So every time you do this, you need to exchange trust between the application and Salesforce. So something from Salesforce has to be plugged in here, and something from here has to be plugged in back into Salesforce. So the key thing is, once I set up this app here, I get the client ID and the client secret. And that is being added here. And from Salesforce, once I do this, I get this information here, the callback URL. That means where should the response be sent back to Salesforce? And that is plugged here. And then you go ahead and you go to a my domain, which is a concept in Salesforce. You go and enable this provider, and that's pretty much it. That's all is the config that's needed for the authentication provider. And the last piece is the concept of the registration handler. So once the response comes back from the third-party provider into Salesforce, Salesforce gives you the option of adding something called a registration handler. This is a piece of Apex code, and I'll show the example that I have here. It's pretty simple. Basically, this is the interface that you need to implement in Apex, and you create an Apex class. It comprises of two methods, the create user method and the update user method. So what this basically means is that once the request comes back, you can actually, on the fly, you can create the user, and you can do things like you can specify which profile does this user need to have. And you can get other information, you can set up the username, things like that. And this is about the creation part. And the update user is another method. That means if your information is getting updated on your third-party provider, that information gets updated automatically. For example, your name information and anything else. So this is basically the registration handler. And most of this code is given to you by Salesforce, like the basis of your code. You don't have to do this from scratch. And then you can customize this as needed for your purposes. So this is the whole concept of the authentication provider working alongside the registration handler to enable you to use a third-party credential. And this is generally called social sign-on. That means you can use a social network to sign into Salesforce. So that's that. Let's go back to our presentation. Moving on. So you have the identity and access management designer certification. I think many of you may be attending the boot camps later this week for this one. I highly recommend this certification. As you know, it's part of the architect designer certifications, and it is a prerequisite for the system architect credential. And therefore, it is a prerequisite for the CTA, which is the Certified Technical Architect, which is the holy grail of all certifications. If I could summarize this certification in like 5 key points, the first thing you need to understand here is everything to do with single sign-on and Salesforce. You could use SAML, you could use OpenID Connect. How do you do SSO in Salesforce? All the different things, you need to be aware of it. The second thing is all the Salesforce identity features that Salesforce provides to you, like my domain. How do you set up the authentication provider? So these are the other things that are covered in this exam. And then the OAuth bit, which comes under access management. So we saw a bit of OAuth. So you need to know all the different OAuth concepts. We saw some of the flows. The key thing is when do you use each flow, right? Which situation do you use a different flow, and what are the use cases of each? So that takes care of the OAuth bit. Then you also need to know about social sign-on. How can you use your social network credentials to log into Salesforce or to log into a Salesforce community, such as the customer community or the partner community? And lastly, you also need to know some of the key security features in Salesforce. These could be two-factor authentication or high assurance sessions. Some of the blogs that I found useful were one by Gemma Emmett. She has written a very cool blog which helped me, and the second one is my blog as well, which I wrote based on my experience with this exam. So definitely I recommend this exam to be taken up if you have any interest in this, and hopefully this gave you some of the basics of the OAuth side of things as part of this session. So just a few other links which I thought were useful for folks. Obviously this gives you a bit of background and helps you learn the basics, but there's a lot of reading to do to learn OAuth subsequently. Some of the key things to point out are the official OAuth website, and the first link basically links all the different OAuth flows that Salesforce supports, along with all the documentation that we have. You could also look at this one here for using Node.js application and JOT bearer authentication with Salesforce. Another one key thing which I really liked was the Salesforce and LinkedIn integration, something to check out. This by a guy called Lalit Kumar. Pretty nice demo that he's shown. And last but not the least, this the identity and access management trail mix. So this trail mix has grown over the years, and I really recommended it. It's really worth the time invested in this trail mix. It really covers everything that you need to know for your exam, especially. So these are some of the key further readings on OAuth. And finally, just to summarize the key takeaways from this session, right? So first and foremost, we learned that there are two distinct concepts: authentication and authorization, identity and access. OAuth 2.0 is used specifically for authorization. It's all about permissions and access management. There are different OAuth flows. We looked at the web server flow and the JOT token bearer flow. These are two options for server-to-server API integrations. Finally, we saw that OpenID Connect is the variation of OAuth, which is used for authentication. And lastly, we also quickly looked at the identity and access management certification, for which the OAuth bit is comprises a significant aspect of that exam. And I highly recommend that you take a look at this exam if you're interested to do so. And with that, thank you all once again for giving me your time, and thank you for the session. Sure.